Good evening. I'm going to welcome everybody to tonight's work session of the Kalispell City Planning Commission on May 13th, 2025. Can I get a roll call?
Rory Young,
Here.
Pip Burke,
Here.
Shelby Lecron,
Here.
Doug Kaufman,
Here.
Joshua Borgart,
Here.
Chad Graham.
Here. We have a quorum present. I'm going to move into tonight's election of officers and open up nominations for president.
Nominate Chad Graham for president.
Second.
Any other nominations? All in favor of the nomination, signify by, is that a roll call? Or okay, signify by saying aye.
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 Right.
I should have said no. Okay, motion carries. Nominations for vice president.
I nominate Rory Young to be vice president.
Second.
Mr. Young, you've been nominated. Is there any discussion for the nomination?
Not for me. Happy to do it.
Okay. All in favor of the nomination signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, we have a vice president and a president. Going to move into tonight's approval of minutes. Is there a motion for approval of the April 8th?
I'll move that we approve the minutes of April 8th, 2025 as published.
Second.
Motion second. Is there any discussion on the motion?
Your mic's on.
Okay, all in favor of the motion signify by stating aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and use this time to hear the public. Tonight, this would be the time to hear from anybody in the public on any item not currently on tonight's agenda. I guess would also include the work session. So we'll take public comment on the agenda items of the work session at that time. But anything else in general would be the time to do it now. Okay, I'm going to close here the public and get into old business.
Okay, so at the last regular meeting, we did have a hearing on the Montana Department of Transportation combination facility. So it was the annexation and conditional use permit to bring in their property at the corner of Rose Crossing and the Highway 93. That was approved at City Council on the 5th, although there is second reading on the initial zoning that's coming up on the 19th.
Okay, new business?
So we'll have a busy meeting next time. So depending upon how the Anderson Ranch work session goes today, we'd anticipate there'd be a public hearing on June 10th for that. We did get some additional information on the reserve at Johnson Ranch, which was something that we had a couple work sessions on earlier this year. So we'll be taking that to a public hearing that night as well. There's also two other applications. One is for an accessory casino at Montana Prime Steakhouse, which is going in on Main Street. Accessory casinos are kind of the walled off separate areas for the casinos. That'd be a conditional use permit again. And then also there's a couple lots between Stillwater River and the north end of Corwin Auto. And they'd be looking at annexing those properties and then expanding out some of their operations onto that lot.
Okay, anything from the commission? Okay, we're gonna, before I adjourn, we're gonna be moving into our work session this evening, and there's two items on that work session. The first item is file KA 25-03, KPUD 25-02, and KPP 25-02. Colton Bear has submitted applications for Anderson Ranch, including request for annexation, initial zoning of R3 residential with a plan unit development overlay and preliminary plat approval for 166 residential lots on approximately 42.5 acres, including lots, roads, and common areas. Second item is our continuation of our work sessions. Last year, the legislature passed Senate Bill 382, which is known as the Montana Land Use Planning Act. Our work session this evening is the 7th And its focus of this work session is discussion of portions of the preliminary draft land use plan. So with that, we're adjourned. We'll be moving into our work session immediately after.
Alrighty. All right. As you mentioned, Colton Bears submitted applications for Anderson Ranch, which includes requests for annexation of just a small portion of that. I'll have better detail on that running through the southern portion. Initial zoning of R3 for that area, along with the PUD overlay, which is actually more of an amendment of a larger PUD that we looked at last year. It would also include preliminary plat approval for 166 residential lots throughout this eastern portion. That's on about 42.5 acres. The majority of the subject property was previously annexed, and this would just bring in that 11.7 acres that's running along this wetlands area. That PUD that we approved last year makes this an amendment to the overall Gardner-Anderson Ranch PUD, which overall is 94.5 acres that had light industrial and commercial on the western portion, and then the residential component on the eastern portion. This is showing that original approval, and you can see while they didn't have a plat at the time, this is showing basically the layout that they were bringing forward today. The western portion would have the light industrial. The Amazon site was being created right here just to the north of where the existing auction house is and where United Drive comes up. Showing a little bit more detail with what we're looking at is that you can see again, this is the Amazon location approximately there, but you can see the B5 light industrial area on the west. This is the existing Anderson Ranch area that was annexed in, and then this kind of arc-shaped property that would be part of the annexation. This photo looking at the property from the east off of DeMarsville Road. The existing zoning on this portion of the PUD is R3, other half is B5. Growth policy shows it is suburban residential, which allows up to 4 units per acre. In this case, they're at 3.9 units per acre, so they'd meet that density requirement. I would note there's a little sliver of this property that would go into the urban mixed use, but for the most part, this is all suburban residential. And then just kind of going through some of the layouts. The reason that they looked at this as a single application and not two different applications was because there was so much that was common between the two in terms of the infrastructure that was going on. And just kind of refresh everybody's memory, this is the sewer layout. One of the reasons it was tied in is there's a lift station at this location here, right along the main road that would be coming through. And that's also serving this upper area or the Gardner portion of that. You can also see where the water system was kind of tied in a similar way. Stormwater on that upper site is designed currently. There's a stormwater facility that's right behind the auto dealers. That's going to be relocated down into the southern portion that's being annexed. That's another factor of where the two different sides are tied in a sense, is the same development. It's showing that conceptual road layout. Here it's showing that extension of Bar H Road that would go out to the highway. There would be a traffic signal eventually as part of that right at that location. This is kind of zooming in on that overall layout. They are looking at doing it in 3 phases. First phase is 40 lots. It would involve the extension of that road to the far property line, which would tie in with some of the improvements that were going on with Amazon and take that out to the highway. That would also include the southern area, that would be the park area and the stormwater. They'd be also constructing the lift station, which would be going on a utility lot at that location. Phase 2 consists of 63 lots, and that's the remainder of that southern area down through here. And phase 3 would be the remainder of the northern area, which would be 54 lots through that section up there. They were asking for 3 deviations. One of them regarded the lot size. Typically, you'd have 6,000 square feet in the R3. The proposal here would allow lots as small as 4,161 square feet, although most of them would be 4,500 square feet. Lot width in this situation, they're requesting a reduction from the standard 50 feet to 45 feet. Would note that there, and it's showing on this detail here, as part of having that smaller lot size, when you drop below 50 feet for frontage for single-family homes, there's an alley requirement. In this case, they don't have those. But in similar situations, we've accepted shared driveways. And in that situation, it allows a pretty extensive frontage that would be unbroken in terms of parking spaces, street trees, fire hydrants, and the like. But then having that shared driveway that would come in that would serve both of the adjacent lots. I'd also note that some of the corner lots would be a little bit tight in terms of setbacks. We've had some discussions there about how they might want to approach that with maybe a slightly different design in terms of the houses that would go on there in order to meet the setback requirements on the corners. They were also asking for a deviation related to one of the roadway segments, and it's just really through this stretch right here. And the reason is it's trying to align these roadways. It's about a little over a 40-foot wide section that would be coming through there. In the long run, when the property that's adjacent would develop into residential, presumably, you would see that road extend up. And so what they're looking at doing would be developing that roadway with the 20-foot paved surface, getting improvements on the west side of that road, and basically setting the stage for that roadway to extend at some point in the future. In the meantime, there would be only one lot, this lot 51, which is at that location, would be the only one that would actually be served by that adjusted roadway design. And then lastly, which wasn't specifically a deviation, but was tied to use, they were noting that they would not be including any ADUs or duplex uses through here. And part of that is just tied to the deviation request for the smaller lot sizes in order to have a little bit more certainty in sideboards on the number of units that might be in there as we're planning out the infrastructure and roads and so forth. There is a wetland that's on the property, and actually floodplain butts up here as well, which is one reason why the area here would be park area and stormwater as opposed to residential construction. They have a 100-foot setback off the delineated wetland and between the wetland and any property line, and the design meets that criteria. One thing that we may adjust, and we're talking about a couple of different ways of potentially doing that, is with the way the streets line up, it kind of created this flag lot up here. And generally flag lots are something that you would use in infill, not with a new layout. So there's a couple different options where we may make some adjustments on there to try to make that work a little bit better. And we'll see if we can have something for you at the public hearing on that. Going back to the utilities, it's probably difficult to see on there. This basically reflects the utilities that were shown as part of the overall PUD that were submitted last summer. But it does include the water line, sewer, the forest main, and the storm line that are all within the subdivision. The southern park area, there's an existing crossing that comes across right through here, which would bring you over to a loop with a pedestrian path. They are showing some improvements on the north side with some playground areas, picnic areas, and so forth. Then would be connected with the walking path as well. Traffic is always something that we want to look at, and with that, I was going to turn it over to Keith to kind of describe what they were looking at in terms of the TIS and traffic improvements.
Thanks, PJ. Yeah, so just to give kind of a 30,000-foot overview of the TIS. One thing, if you guys take a look at that TIS that was submitted with this, to keep in mind is that the TIS actually addresses both halves of this development. So the commercial half, which is about 56 acres of commercial, plus the 42.5 acres of residential. The Amazon project is a big traffic driver for the commercial site. With their phases on the commercial, there's 4 different phases, and on the residential, 3 different phases, as PJ mentioned. They looked at a lot of the intersections in the surrounding area, and that includes the bypass and Highway 93 intersection, the Cemetery Road and bypass intersection, the Cemetery Road and Highway 93 slash Willow Glen intersection, Willow Glen and Lower Valley Road, United Drive and Lower Valley Road, and the new intersection, which would be Bar H and Highway 93, and DeMarsville and Lower Valley Road, and DeMarsville and Bar H. So we looked at all of those different intersections. The city standards require that if there is a level of service drop, that level of service must be mitigated. So with these different phasing, it's really hard to tell as these develop out, which phase is going to come before the other. So they looked at the phasing that was provided by the different developments, and the 2026 phase would be the phase one, which includes the Amazon project. That would include the Bar H connection out to Highway 93, but no signal would be installed at that intersection with that phase one. What the TIS found is that phase two, the way that the TIS looked at phase two was the second phase of the commercial development plus the first phase of the residential development. That would take it close to requiring the signal at Highway 93. Prior to phase three, which includes another phase of the commercial and the second phase of the residential, that signal would need to be installed. We had a meeting with MDT to discuss the TIS, and MDT's preference is to require a warrant analysis with each phase of development. So as either a new phase on the commercial comes in or a new phase on the residential comes in, we'd want that warrant analysis to be completed. There would be a requirement for turning a movement restriction at the existing intersection of United Drive and Highway 93. So right now, United Drive kind of comes up to the southern end of that commercial PUD, and then it 90s and heads west out to Highway 93. It's a note, a kind of a side note, that little section of United Drive, currently the east-west portion of that connects out to Highway 93, is going to be renamed in the future. United Drive will continue north and tie into Lower Valley Road, and that'll be a collector street that's a major collector up to Bar H and a minor collector up to Lower Valley Road. There would also need to be at a certain phase of development between the commercial and residential right and left turn lanes at Willow Glen and Lower Valley Road. So as you're coming on Lower Valley Road westbound, and you kind of tie into that, this is kind of a strange intersection at just north of the car dealership there. There would need to be a right turn lane and a left turn lane. The TIS also calls out a right turn lane for the west leg of the Cemetery Road and US 93 intersection. And I think that's all of the improvements that would be required through the TIS, if I'm remembering correctly. So that's a big view. We're going to have to get, we're going to have to wordsmith some conditions as we come forward with this, so that we have something that'll work for each development as it comes forward. I guess the overview would be that at some point that signal is going to be warranted. We're going to have to look at each phase of development as it comes through between the residential and the commercial. Side note also is that they looked at a 5-year build out for both of these developments, and a 2.6% background growth. They also, based on the traffic counts that they took, they looked at the seasonality factor for those counts, which would have adjusted their counts in the field down, and they used the higher counts rather than adjusting those down, just to be a little conservative on their TIS. We had a third party review the TIS, and they submitted an amendment to the original one. We concurred with all the findings of the amended TIS, so that's it.
Bob Foson's not here, so haven't we been through this before with a warrant analysis in that you cannot do a warrant analysis unless the traffic is existing?
Yeah, we
By
did.
which time it's too late to put in a traffic signal because it takes 2 years to get it approved.
We did talk to them about that. They said they would look at what was planned in that individual phase to, so the traffic that would be generated either by the commercial development or the residential development for that phase would be applied to the warrant analysis for that phase.
So at final plat, potentially, rather than waiting for final plat and then for all the development to happen, we could require it at the final plat stage, presuming that will build out.
I just know that they can't put a traffic signal in unless the warrants are met, not maybe met or could be met. So you may end up in a situation where you have the signal, but you can't activate it because you don't have the traffic.
They indicated that, at least in the meeting that we recently had, that they would look at the existing traffic as that phase is coming in, and then the projected traffic from the phase that's being proposed to determine whether the warrant analysis would be met or not. So it wouldn't be that phase has to be built out and then move forward. It would be what's existing plus what's proposed in this upcoming phase to determine the warrant analysis.
But you're right, this is a little bit different approach than they've taken historically on that, but it is a kind of a movement that they've tried to make over the last couple of years, is to try to look at some of that projected traffic in these type of situations to try to avoid the issues that you were raising there.
Like we had with Rose Crossing.
Right.
Yeah. And as far as that goes, there's still federal designed warrants. So they're not our state warrants. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're warrants based off of the MUTCD,
Yeah.
and there's warrant 1, 2, and 3 that this would potentially meet with phase 3 of this combined phasing between the two developments.
And does the state get money from the federal government to assist with this type of thing?
Generally, no. This would be a developer cost, and they would typically provide funds to MDT that would go into an account that they would pull out of when the warrants are met, typically.
Do you have a copy of the old phasing plan so I could refresh my memory of the industrial side?
Phasing plan on the other side?
On
So-
the industrial side, yeah.
Yeah, well, they really didn't have any, I mean, when it came through, it was really geared towards, oh, I gotta go further back.
Remember.
Yeah, so when they came in, we did the PUD that covered the whole area. We didn't have any plat that came through. And so what they were looking at is, phase 1 was really, and it was created with the boundary line adjustment to create the Amazon parcel. And then everything else would be somewhat conceptual, although those roads are going to need to be in those places, and the utilities are going to need to be in those places. And then this was always kind of a separate thing because it was a separate developer. And again, just kind of tied in with so much infrastructure that kind of needed to come through as one package.
Are you good?
Yep.
With this map, so the half road that is part of the PUD, why does that not continue north?
On this side over here, yeah, this layout was a little bit different. Let me go back to this. Are you talking about with this connection right there?
Yep.
Extending all the way up to that north property line, you mean?
Yeah, because the road on the west there where that black T is up in the northwest corner, that's a future connection through to Lower Valley Road, right?
Correct.
And so I'm just wondering, why does this road not also make a connection through there?
Yeah. Yeah. think part of it kind of comes up into the mini storage that's there.
It would go to basically a non-developable piece, that's why. So leaving it open to the east, you could highlight that. That piece there will have access. Could have an east-west road as well as the way it was kind of laid out. It would allow for development to happen on that piece, but right on the property line, you're pretty much splitting property line and it's gonna dead end.
Jared,
It's gonna dead end halfway into that storage facility, that's why.
it just looks like it's on a property line there. So the idea being, if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah, PJ, no.
That was the old layout.
I know. Well, but because it has both. So the United Drive is the one that's is almost like a frontage road, right?
Right, down through here and would extend up that direction, right?
So that's the one primary north-south connection. And then it looks like we have another one, which is basically the west street within the residential subdivision.
Right through there. And then DeMarsville's out here as well. I mean, that's going to be the primary north-south.
Yeah, so we're making provision for the west street to go through, but not for the street two over.
Right, and as we're mentioning through here, part of that is because you wind up going into what that mini storage facility in that location. But what it's setting it up for is so that you can have this property develop and then tie into that. If that roadway extends up, you could have this street extend across that way and then be able to build off of that and still have that connection. So, but in this
That'll make
situation
that
here,
block
you've
too
got,
long though, right?
you've got 3 north-souths that would come up with United, with this road, and then with DeMarsville that would go up as well.
But it's gonna make that block too long.
Not if with one right there.
Yeah, and there's also potential connections that could come up with these parcels. There's roads that come up in those directions as well.
All right, I was just curious.
You could also, you see the street right here. So if this were to annex and subdivide, what you would imagine is this street coming through with kind of mirrored lots on the north and south, probably 2 lots right here to complete this street. But this street right here could be extended north with that right here. That would make more sense than right here.
I was just
Yeah.
checking that.
Yeah.
It just immediately was like, hey, that doesn't go anywhere. Then on maybe I misread, I heard that on the parkland and the wetland, you said that there's a 100-foot setback, but I thought I read that they were requesting a 50-foot setback.
No, there's a 100-foot setback from the wetland to the property line,
So then what was the
and
discussion?
they're not deviating from that.
in the measurement of park area, there was a request.
When they showed that, but that wasn't the measurement. I think what they were trying to show there, were you looking at that, or?
It was in the narrative or in the text. There was something about this is the amount of parkland that is available, but we're requesting a 50-foot deviation in order to classify it as parkland and not wetland setback.
Yeah, I'm not sure you know what that was referring to. Sure.
In the subdivision regulations under parkland, there's a provision that says that you can only count 50% of the floodplain area within the park, count that as park. And what we were trying to do is basically, we've got a 100-year floodplain on the bottom part of this park. And this area hasn't flooded since 1964. So it'd actually be a beautiful park, and it's going to be a park whether we get to call it a park or not. So we're just trying to utilize it as park. And so that's, I think, what I was trying to spell out in my request.
And my only thought for you, Eric, is I have recent battle scars about the definition of a park. So I'm just remember that going forward, that what you think is a park and what Chad thinks is a park and what PJ thinks a park are not always
Not me.
Well, and that
not
was
this Chad.
that was my reasoning for trying to explain that. And I have had some good discussions with Chad recently, but like I said, I mean, if we were in an area that was inundated on a regular basis, I can totally see not counting as parkland, but, you know, it hasn't flooded in 61 years. And its chance of flooding are pretty darn low. So for, you know, somebody's lifetime, they might never see water on that park. And even if they did see water, it'd be for a short period of duration. But it is a beautiful piece of property. It's as nice as Lawrence Park. That wetland area down there is just absolutely gorgeous and wooded. And it's perfect for trails and, you know, if somebody wanted to go play Frisbee down on the bottom part, it's beautifully flat. It's a hayfield, essentially. And the upper bench, where we are putting the playground is beautiful, has beautiful views out over the valley. So we just think it makes great parkland.
I don't doubt that you guys will do a good job. Just watch out for them details.
Appreciate that.
Thanks, Eric. I guess, can you clarify on the PUD is an overlay that sits on the property no matter who owns it, right? My concern or my question is there's mention of two owners but one PUD, and they're all friends now, but what happens if that changes? Then
Yeah.
the PUD still overrides their friendship, right?
It does, yeah. So it's a zoning overlay, so basically it modifies the base zoning that's in that district, but it's part of the zoning. Actually, when it's approved by council, the initial zoning and the PUD are done in the same ordinance, so.
So I understand that right at the moment, everyone is probably benefiting from this, but once that PUD is in place, it would require a PUD amendment over potentially the whole property if some use wanted to change, right?
It would, yeah.
And so that applies to everything with shared water and sewer, and it looks like some of that stormwater from the commercial is going across.
It is, it's going down into, to this area.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, the major things would be the lift station, because, and it's not just for this area down here, but some of that area up on top is coming down to that lift station as well. So that's where there's a real symbiotic relationship here, and, you know, neither development can really completely stand on its own. So it would take some unraveling of engineering and conditions to do anything other than working together on that.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to see that they're working together and making it work. That's all I got.
Anything else from the commission? Excuse me. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and open this item up for public comment. If there's any public comment, please come to the mic and state your name and address.
Hello, my name is Eric Mulcahy with Sand Surveying, 2 Village Loop, Kalispell, and I'm representing Colton Bear on this project and also working with Todd Gardner and his family on the other side. And to answer Doug Kaufman's question, we'll be most likely be coming in with a plat on the commercial side here shortly. And we're looking at the second phase of, if Amazon's the first phase, the second phase will probably be the lots and the backage roads on the parcels closest to the highway, and then look either north or south along United Drive as being like the third and fourth phase. So, so that's mostly how it's going to come about. And the lots, for the most part, aren't changing from what we proposed in the initial PUD. For the most part, Colton Bear's project hasn't changed from our original concept, although we did, working with the Andersons, who Colton is purchasing the property from and still live in their homestead on the portion on Demarsville. We put a green belt buffer between the Andersons and the subdivision, and added the additional parkland to get our densities to work. And between now and the next meeting, we'll try to address PJ's items on, particularly on those north few lots, to try to address that flag lot situation. Again, we're pretty much following what we started with last year. I will say that both the Gardners and Bear have entered into written agreements for basically cost sharing of a lot of these improvements, including the signal when its warrants are met, or if the MDOT requires payment in advance. They've got an agreement basically to cost share that as well. So they've got pretty solid agreements to work together on this. And as planning staff alluded, they kind of need to work together to make this whole thing function properly. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, should you have any more.
Any more questions? Thanks. Any further public comment? Okay, I'm gonna move on to our second item this evening, which will be our work session on the Montana Land Use Planning Act.
Chad, quit. Donnie broke my TV.
That was the new city hall.
Good evening, and thank you, Planning Commission. Donnie McGrath, Planner 2.
50 seconds, thanks.
And good evening, public, and welcome. We appreciate you taking the time to be here. What we are discussing tonight represents an important chapter in Kalispell's path forward, one that centers on housing, community, and long-term vision. Tonight, we're discussing Chapter 4 of our preliminary draft land use plan, housing. This chapter is about how we respond to the needs of real people, not just numbers. Under MLUPA, the Montana Land Use Planning Act, planning becomes more proactive. This meeting is one of the most important opportunities for public input. We're here to talk about growth, housing, access, and community resilience, and how we get there together. Kalispell is projected to grow by 63% by 2045, reaching over 54,000 residents. That translates to a need for 8,800 to 10,000 new housing units. Homes for our teachers, healthcare workers, business owners, and families. Our 2.5% annual growth projection builds on a decade of steady expansion and increasing demand across northwest Montana. The bottom line, this isn't about whether we grow, it's about how we grow. Today's average rent is around $1,650, lower than the national average, but still stretching many budgets. Our vacancy rate is barely above 1%. That means very few options, particularly for renters. Median home prices have dipped from their peak to $574,000, but affordability remains a challenge. These numbers reflect a housing system under pressure, and they reinforce why planning ahead is so important. Kalispell has just under 16,000 housing units. To be exact, 15,847. 60% are single-family homes. The rest is a mix of multifamily, townhomes, and manufactured housing. Since 2021, we've approved 7,500 new homes. About 2,000 are built, leaving 5,500 ready for construction. These approvals represent up to 85% of our future need. But now we need to focus on delivery, building the right types of housing in the right locations. Kalispell has the land to grow. 2,484 acres of vacant land within the city limits. 96% zoned for housing. Add 3,871 more acres in our annexation area. 88% that can also support housing. This gives us the flexibility to accommodate growth without sprawling or straining infrastructure. Through infill, mixed-use development, and strategic annexation, we can expand while staying connected, efficient, and community-focused. Affordability. Local wages aren't keeping up with the housing cost. We risk losing workforce if we don't act. Our demographics, seniors, single-person households, and younger residents need different housing than what we've built in the past. Rental pressure. Our vacancy rate shows how little inventory is available. Pressure will persist unless more options come online. Fragmented development. We've seen piecemeal growth in some areas. It's time for more coordinated approach. Our goal is a resilient housing system, one that works for everyone. That means building a range of housing types in places where people can thrive near jobs, transportation, schools, and parks. It means designing neighborhoods that reflect Kalispell's character while embracing smart, future-ready planning. And it means ensuring that growth adds value, not just volume, to our community. Under MALUPA, we'll choose 5 housing strategies from a menu of 14. But those decisions will be shaped by public input. Your voice is part of how we get this right. Your insights will help guide investment, zoning, and housing program priorities. Whether it's a neighborhood revitalization, mixed-use planning, or new financing tools, the path forward needs broad support. Thank you for being here tonight. This is just the beginning of a longer dialogue, and your input will shape the choices we make moving forward. And in closing, let's plan for a Kalispell that grows with purpose, preserves what we value, and welcomes everyone who calls this place home. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, public. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer. And then PJ will be leading off with the 14 housing strategies.
Go ahead.
This is much easier when we can just push a button and swap.
Do you guys ever think of just swapping seats?
Never.
That would be too easy.
So we've talked about these housing. Let's get that. We've talked about these housing strategies in the past, and just as kind of refresh everybody's recollection, part of the Montana Land Use Planning Act requires us to adopt at least 5 of 14 housing strategies that are outlined in state statute. So these aren't options that we've come up with that we were looking for people to select from. They're pretty much mandated from the state and how they're laid out by the state. Although it does give us the flexibility for the most part with these with which ones we want to select, with some exceptions that are now mandated on that as well. But what we wanted to do tonight was just kind of step through these. We don't need to make selections tonight, but we did kind of want to get some feel for what kind of support there is out there for some of them, and maybe a lack of support for some of them. One of the things that will be reflected in that memo that I put out there is we have been doing a fair amount of community outreach. Back in March and again in July, we'll be doing this as well, is going out and having pop-ups in different locations. We went to Sykes, we went to Bias, things like that, and got some feedback on those live versions. There were boards that we had up with each one of these housing strategies, and people could put stickers up there kind of as vote. You could visually see that support. We also have a survey that's available on our website, engagekalispell.com, where people can go and kind of say which one of these strategies they would support. So when we're talking about the relative support that we're seeing to this point, that's what we're basing that on. But we're continuing to get that input, and we will be throughout most of the summer, at least anyway, as we're working through this. So with that, starting off with the first strategy was basically a form of an ADU. And really both of these here would have that. One is allowing a duplex whenever a single family residence is allowed, and the other is a second home on any property where a single family residence is allowed. And like I said, these are two different versions of the same thing. Right now, under state law, we have to allow an ADU on any property. And so this is effectively meeting our existing state law. Under 382, we can opt out of that if we want to. So that's something that's available that if we don't want to do this full thing, we can steer away from. The main difference between these two, again, these two options is one is in a duplex, you'd have one structure. You wouldn't have a separate standalone structure on the property. The other variation of this option would be to allow a second home. Let me try to get my laser pointer up there. For some reason, it's not working. Any case, this one here would allow the second home. So this would be, a converted garage or something along those lines. In terms of support from the community, I would say this one here got the third highest level of support with allowing the duplex. Whereas splitting that out, and even though it's still just a second unit on the property, that second standalone structure only had the 8th highest, so it was a little bit less supported to have that version of that ADU.
PJ, how does it apply towards areas with HOAs? To say
So,
the duplex aspect of it.
well, I would
Or
presume,
ADU.
because currently under the bills that were passed in the last legislative session, they specifically said that HOAs could have covenants that would not allow those. I would presume that would be acceptable under this strategy. Malupa
I
doesn't
thought that
specifically
they
say
went through
that.
and did some exemptions for HOAs. I think that's what you just said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're included in there. I presume that would still be something that could carry forward in here because that's generally how state law is set up.
That was a big part of the lawsuit
Right.
as well. But essentially what it's doing is maybe some of the older parts of town that were created well before HOAs were even thought of don't have the benefit of an HOA, although they could form one, although it's not easy. They'll be subject to these rules, whereas a lot of the newer subdivisions won't be. Essentially, because they've got HOAs in place that wouldn't allow for it, and we can't require them to do it. So.
So any other questions relative to the ADUs? Any comments? I mean, where are people at in regards to those?
Well, I think where I'm going with that kind of is a lot of stuff we go through and end up doing, like we even saw tonight, it's all new development and everything. So a lot of the stuff we're talking about is going to be, because of the exclusion of HOAs, is going to be pointed towards either older lots, older subdivision, or older parts of town, I should say, for, I guess, maybe infill. I mean, right?
It can be. I would say that, in 21 is when the council amended the zoning ordinance to allow ADUs through most of the town, but did exclude out the R2 and R3 zones as primarily single family. But since that time, we've only issued 5 ADU permits throughout the entire city.
Right.
So that's something that would eventually kind of come into that calculation too, is, they're not very widespread out there. And if they're already allowed throughout most of the city, it would be a consideration of whether we'd want to include that as a strategy, or if we'd rather opt for something else. So it'd just be a consideration.
All
as
I'm
part of
saying is one of the reasons why they went through and did this whole land use planning act is to generate more housing. And then it's excluded from HOAs, so it cuts a whole lot of it out. And so basically the point of this is looking for infill projects and everything. And, I just wanted to see if I had that right. So. Go ahead.
One thing that just in reading through the 14 different ones, you sometimes said that they're third from the top and sometimes said they're eighth from the bottom. And like if there were only 10, that would be in the same position. And so it certainly for me, just because there's 14 and some of them overlap and some of them don't, it would be helpful to, and I know you're trying not to lead the witness, but it would be helpful to at least rank them in different formats. Like here's what development services, if we got to choose, here's what we would do. Here's what the public would do. Here's what seems to make sense under state law. It would just help if I could eliminate 3 of these and then I only have to pick 5 out of 10.
And I think eventually we'd get to breaking that down a little bit more. Right now, we were in the middle of getting that public comment, so we didn't want to have a specific ranking. It's just working with raw data at this point, coming off of something. But we wanted to give some kind of an indication to you in the work session about where we were seeing things heading with that. So that's why it was phrased that way, and we didn't want to get it too nailed down at this point while we were still trying to elicit the comments.
Okay. But just when we do get to that decision making, having pointing in one direction consistently would be helpful.
Yeah,
And then
okay.
just, if we can shoot a couple of them dead before we get there, then that'd be even better.
Yeah, okay. Any other ADU comments or duplex comments on those? So if not, the next one actually had quite a bit of support. It's had the highest amount of support through our community outreach. This was allowing higher density housing near public transit, places of employment, or a college. And in a lot of ways, we already do this. Places that you would expect to see employment and public transit are mostly our commercial zones. And in those commercial zones, we don't have, especially for multifamily, we don't have any specific density caps. It all comes down to design and fitting everything onto the property in terms of storm and parking and everything else that you would need to have. So in a lot of ways, we're already there with that. But like I said, this was tied for the highest amount of support that we were seeing out in the community.
And
So what happens when you draft bills at the state level on cities that don't really even have a college campus or public transit so the way we're interpreting this is, yes, our commercial centers, those nodes on our map, the B1 zone, so these other areas where we could see, we're calling where it says public transit, as you look at our documents, we're going to be saying like transportation corridors, not public transit, because we don't really have public transit here. I don't even know if there's, other than bus system, if there's any public transit in the state, so it's kind of odd. But that's the way we're interpreting that, just so the planning commission is aware as we move forward, that like commercial corridors, transportation corridors is where we would be looking at potentially implementing a housing option like that.
Jared, do you want to maybe, you mentioned the nodes. I know what you're talking about. I don't know if the rest of the board understand the donuts, the little dots on the growth policy map.
Right, so the nodes that you're referring to there, so they're neighborhood business nodes along with some high density residential that's around that. And so we encourage them, they're shown on the map. We want to encourage those more, but the idea behind those is, especially as you're getting into more outlying areas, you don't necessarily want people driving all the way into town to pick up the gallon of milk and then back home. But having neighborhood scale business at some of the major intersections that are out there, so they can be potentially even walk to those locations. But taking advantage of some of the infrastructure that's in place, and that also minimizes the amount of miles traveled on the roads as well. But those are those nodes that he's referring to.
So can we incorporate that a description of those, whatever, those nodes, those community centers in our adoption of, if we choose that, with Jared, you're saying it allow higher density near public transit. Well, if you don't have public transit, then can you say, well, it makes sense to include it as a neighborhood commercial donut or whatever?
Yeah, and we refer to those nodes in the current growth policy. We would extend that over. If this was a strategy that you chose to follow, then we would probably enhance the encouragement of that within the growth policy or land use plan.
Which in the way that would be broken out is those nodes allow for, say, neighborhood commercial zoning or a B1 zone, which allows commercial at up to 60-foot high, which transitions into multifamily housing. And so we can kind of lay that out as to how that would look, which actually falls right in line with that concept, so.
It seems like it meets the intent of that, but it's not exactly worded the same, so. Yeah.
It's worded differently, and part of that is I think that language got borrowed from other states when they drafted that, and so it would make more sense in more metro areas. But I think the concept, as Jared described, would be the same. You're trying to maximize what your infrastructure is there and allow the higher density in those locations. Next one is reducing required off-street parking to no more than one space per home or unit. I would say this didn't generate a lot of support with the community outreach, was the fifth lowest. But one of the things that's kind of happened in the meantime is that the legislature approved a bill that's basically mandating this. For a land use plan city, it mandates that cities cannot require more than one parking space per residential unit and cannot require any parking for childcare, deed restricted housing, assisted living, or residential units under 1,200 square feet. The effective date for that new state statute would be October of '26. So if we choose to adopt that now, then that can count as one of our housing strategies. If we don't, we're going to have to effectively adopt it next year anyway. So even though it didn't have a lot of support with that, it may make sense to include that as one that we would do because it would satisfy one of those requirements.
Yeah, it would certainly seem so.
Yeah.
We're looking at that and being enacted in '26. I don't know why we wouldn't include it.
Yeah, it made sense to us.
From a practical standpoint, we're not seeing the desire to do this with new development. Once again, we don't have public transit here. So we could plan for more density in areas where maybe in the future, 40, 50 years from now, you could see things. But the issue I potentially have with this, although it's required of us now, is there's going to be very opportunistic buys of property that are going to try and take full advantage of a property and not do any parking. In an area where parking's probably already strained, we see that all the time. So if it continues to happen, likely the scenario will be where there's likely going to be a public works standard where we're going to have to look at on-street parking and basically say no on-street parking. Because what'll happen is they'll start to park on the street. We won't be able to provide services. We won't be able to plow. We won't be able to get emergency vehicles through. So we'll have to continue to consult people. If you do no parking, on-street parking is not a guaranteed. It's city property. And if it gets to the point where it's affecting city services, that's why it's not really a good idea. Because like I said, new developments are going to handle their parking. We've seen that. But like I said, people get very opportunistic on infill properties. And those are the situations where you can start to change the neighborhood character pretty quickly and affect existing property owners pretty quickly. And we'll likely see that scenario happen quite a bit. So it will likely change some of our process with how we would look at on-street parking. And that's just the way we're probably going to have to handle that.
It seems like that's another one that was borrowed from a city where you can walk out of your apartment, jump on the train or walk to work or somewhere. I mean, we just don't, our weather is not that conducive to carrying armfuls of groceries 7 blocks.
Yeah,
Well, I've had those
I don't know if this one came
conversations.
from out of state so much. If you look at the early text of the bill, it almost outlawed parking in general. If we required more than like one parking space for the first 15,000 square feet of retail, then the city had to pay the developer to build it so the city had to fund it for them. All that got dropped out of the bill eventually, and it just came down to what the requirement is now. But again, I mean, it's just, if that's what we have to do anyway, it might as well count as one of them. So we would recommend going with it just because of that.
Yeah, I don't disagree that it's an easy one to knock off, but like Jared said, the practicality of it, a 2-bed, 2-bath apartment, there's a very good chance that that's 2 young professionals and they're each going to have their own vehicle and you're just,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the other thing that we would find too is like even right now when our apartment standard is 1.5 per unit, most developers are coming in and want to build 2. And that state statute doesn't have a maximum. It's just what the minimum that you would require. And so most developers are coming in and requiring more than what our minimum requirements are anyway, just because that's what the market demands here.
We'll just put an asterisk by it, says state mandated or something. Because
So-
these things will come up as an issue in the
Oh,
next
it will.
couple of years.
So we
It's gonna
get,
come up as an issue.
I mean, think at 12th Street, it was ironic that it got support because we even have local down on 12th Street around the high school. This issue comes up all the time. The parking, if it's not provided, a high school event happens, that's the reason off-street parking is required. And as we see more development and because of the cost of housing, you see more families doubling up. You see roommates doubling up. You may see 2 families in a 3-bed, 2-bath house, so they may have 4 cars. It's just, that's what we're seeing, even in the multifamily developments. That's why, as PJ mentioned, our requirement's only 1.5, but they're thinking they may need 2.5 or 3 spots per unit, just knowing that a lot of these units, like I said, it's not just 1 car in a unit in multifamily. You have 2 or 3 cars per unit in a multifamily building in order to keep the cost down, so.
Okay, so the next strategy is reducing impact fees for additional residential units on a lot, which would be ADUs by 25%. Honestly, I think this one gets a little bit sticky, and part of it is just kind of understanding just kind of in general how impact fees come together is you're establishing capital plans that the city is looking at for improvements that are necessary to serve growth that would be city funded through the impact fee program. And just as a general rule, if you drop it for one, you're going to tend to have increasing pressure on the other ones. It becomes an equity issue as to where that cost shift is happening. And besides that, it was the 3rd lowest amount of support from community outreach. So between those 2 factors, it didn't seem like one that made sense to necessarily pursue.
can we backdate it and say we already dropped our impact fee?
There was discussion when this bill went through about what we could count and not count. Next one is allowing for single room occupancies. So basically rental of a single bedroom with a shared kitchen and bathroom. And kind of as Jared alluded to, I mean, it's, we currently allow roommates. That's a factor in there. It's not as strict, when people talk about single family zoning, it's not strictly only people that are related by blood anyway. And so in a lot of ways, we kind of allow this. I think what this may expand it to would be more formal situations like the old boarding house, where you might have a separate locked room or locked suite with a central area that would be out, kitchen and living facilities. So this would probably expand what we do kind of more informally right now. But this was one that had the 6th highest level of support. So there'd be some level of support for that out in the community. And it'd be somewhere between the existing single-family type of housing that we would have and a duplex or an ADU in terms of housing capacity. So, any thoughts on those?
Was that excluded from HOAs? I think a lot of it was.
I'm not aware
I
of
think there's a
anything
lot
in
of
state law that would
legislators that
prohibit
live in
as HOA
HOAs.
from doing that. So, I mean, that comes down to covenants. We're not regulating what the covenants say on that.
And this is specifically and intentionally different than a VRBO or a Airbnb.
It's definitely different in that situation, although in theory, I guess you could have something that would come up with that. Airbnbs often are single room type of rentals with that too. So I think that if we went down this route, it probably would expand somewhat the current situation, but it's not that different than the current situation where roommates are a very common thing to have out there.
There's some building code things that come into play with this as well. Building code has certain area requirements for housing and factors directly into this. So, like I said, essentially we already allow it to a certain extent depending on how this is being played out, but you could look at this as a house being rented to 3 college kids separate. I mean, it's very common. We wouldn't say you can't do that even now. So that's how we would be looking at this one.
Okay, so the next one was allowing for 3 or 4 unit apartments wherever a single family residence is allowed. So this is kind of taking that ADU thing and taking it up a notch or two. In terms of community support for this, it was tied for the 3rd lowest. There wasn't a ton of support for that. As a side note, the legislature did entertain a bill that would mandate this specifically, whether you were a 382 city or not. That made it most of the way through the legislature. So we'll see what happens the next time around. I don't know if that's coming back or not, but that did not pass through with this legislative cycle. So it would be an option that's on the table, but it does take it up quite a bit in terms of additional density from what those ADUs would. Is there a comfort level in going to 3 or 4 units on a parcel?
My only thought is I spent a lot of time in Bozeman in the last few years, and I never can get my bearings there. South of Main Street, between Main Street and the fairgrounds, if you walk around that neighborhood, if you know what you're looking for, there are a ton of these things in there. Single-family residences that are being converted to a triplex or a fourplex. If you don't know what you're looking for, if you're just driving through, I'm not sure that you would experience that. And I'm not strongly for or against it. I was thinking about it last time I was wandering around there, and I was thinking, there's a lot of these things that you just don't really notice.
The reason why I say no is because if something were to come through with, say I'm looking at new development, you're talking about probably infill or something that goes through and gets redeveloped.
I think it's
But
redevelopment from what I've seen. But
Right, so redevelopment. But if I'm looking at something that's coming in and it's been approved by us in the council as single family, and then it moves forward later on, somebody else buys it or something, and then they decide to go through and take, while it's single family, we can go through it. Am I reading that wrong? Are they allowed to do the 3 or 4plex?
With this, would be any place where a single family dwelling is allowed,
So
you can do a fourplex. Would be
So that's what I'm saying is the problem with that is the subdivision's gone through a TIS, it's gone through all kinds of study. We know what the capacities are for that subdivision. Now all of a sudden somebody comes in and takes and quadruples the impact and capacity in that subdivision. We don't know where we're at with our capacities. The TIS is wrong because there's more density there. So to tell you the truth, this is why I like having the planned unit developments with the developer agreement, because at least we know what we're getting. So something like this, and I feel the same way about the duplex as well, but it's certainly not as bad as this. But
Yeah, you could see the balancing act we're playing because as Donnie did his presentation, you saw the number of housing units we approved, and we've approved a lot of these, but they're planned and they're new developments, and we're not trying to drop them into an existing neighborhood. But that's what this does. This takes an east side historic single-family home, says you could tear it down and build a fourplex.
unless it's an HOA.
Unless it's in an HOA, unless you're, yes, in Silverbrook or Westview Estates or something like that. Yes, so you can, and it is in the guise of infill and redevelopments of downtown and getting more density, but you also have to be able to provide services and get plows down the street and all those things that come along with it that we have to consider. So, yeah, it doesn't make any distinction on lot size, density. So, I mean, essentially you could plop a fourplex on, a 6,000 square foot lot. It's an option. The thing to consider once again with something like this is, which historically zoning, you're trying to protect neighborhoods and preserve neighborhoods for what they are. Not that you can't plan and plan for the future. We did it with the core area, but some neighborhoods don't want to change. And, when you're looking at new development, so I mean, that's something you have to do. If this were allowed outright, then, I mean, yes, you'll have areas of town that were historically single family, had a certain character that would change into this. And I think we even have had some of it in town. If you look back to some of the historic homes on the east and west sides, the old homes were cut up into triplexes and fourplex. It's kind of has converted back because the houses have gotten so valuable, they started to get remodeled and such, but those wouldn't meet today's building codes anyways. That happened a long time ago. So I don't think you're going to get many single-family homes to meet the building codes. I mean, a fourplex gets into a whole nother level of construction versus a duplex or a triplex. So I don't think most of the time you'd even be able to convert an existing house. You would likely have to tear it down and build something new.
So I understand that there's a complication with providing utilities, whether it's sewer, water, and services, but I know Keith probably can't answer this, and he's looking at me sideways already, but how, like in the old part of town, which is probably where this is where the impact will be felt, are we that close to capacity in some of those utilities? Or, I mean, is there a mechanism that like now, when we do a subdivision, we have to prove, or we have to ask for a will serve letter from the city, and, can you put that kind of a mechanism in place that you can only do a fourplex, a rebuild on a fourplex on that if the city has capacity? I mean, is that our backstop, that you couldn't tear down a whole city block and put all new in because at some point that sewer and water capacity is going to be used up?
Yeah, for redevelopment, for a situation like this where you'd be building a 3 or 4 unit apartment, Public Works never sees that. The right-of-way permit, we would look at, construction stormwater permit, but the building permit isn't something that we would review. And so that would have to be, I think, probably a change in our policy of how we would review those. There are certainly areas in town where we have limited capacity with, undersized sewer mains, 6-inch petrified clay pipe sewer mains that, where they're holding on by a thread in a lot of our older parts of town.
So then my follow-up, and I will tread very carefully here, is I don't want to suggest, but there is a potential for some kind of a residential building permit system for anything more than 2 units, depending on how you fit that into state law, that then would look at the appropriateness. I mean, that gives you the opportunity for Public Works to review the capacities, but then it also potentially would give us an opportunity to look at suitability of construction. I don't want to say it's an architectural review for that kind of thing, but I don't. And maybe I'm trying too hard for one little thing. I'm just curious about what the options are, because, and I know we're not Bozeman, but it just doesn't. When you walk through that neighborhood, it doesn't feel that different.
Yeah, that's why so Missoula's land use plan, this is how they're getting their new housing. They're just essentially, there's no single university district, all that. Every house you see there can become a fourplex or a fiveplex or a 6. So there is no single family zoning in that city anymore. It's just dense everywhere. So part of it is, how does the city want to grow? As you know, at Tronstad, we do a single family lot on 6,000 feet and it's dense. So we're kind of fighting development, what people are used to in the county versus, for us, a single family lot is dense. But it's certainly an option. I know when we are doing the facility planning, we are trying to account for a certain percentage of infill in these areas to kind of categorize that, what the capacity needs will be. So we are doing that. But and there are benefits to it because it's a hypothetical. You're could be adding density to an existing system. So then the system, problem is our system's old to begin with. Can it even handle it?
Well, and
So-
the other aspect of the capacity part of it is I think we spent around $15 million for the West Side Interceptor. And it'd be good to know, and maybe there's a way to go and calculate after, well, I don't even know, after a subdivision is completely built out, you go back and figure out how it was completely rebuilt or how it was completely built out. And I guess you know what your capacity is for that subdivision. You can back the calculation into what do we really have in our lines on the West Side Interceptor. But without doing any of that, if some of these subdivisions take 5-10 years to build out, you're going to have to keep track of how things are being built so we know we're not leaving any space on the table in that line that we spent so much money to put in.
In general, we do that. So every year we update our water and our sewer model to account for growth. And so we can kind of take that capacity back out of the main, and we know as new developments coming in, what's available. So in a way, we're doing that. But, I think where the growth areas are one thing. I think it would be a little harder would be the redevelopment areas where we already have infrastructure that's undersized for our current standards. And so, to try to make that work with some of these would be difficult. We'd probably have to change our processes. PJ mentioned that, 3 or 4 units would come into site review. So that would be a way that we could actually review that from public works standpoint. But
Well, and I guess the other thing would, potentially that we can look at other cities that have either already adopted this, because in the same way that we're looking at the ADUs and saying, when the word ADU came in, we were all running around like, but there's only been 5 issued in the last 5 years. So maybe this is not that, before we just say, no, we don't want it, is it a 5% of the neighborhood that's likely, or is it 15%? And I know that those are kind of guesses, but if it's not a significant impact, and I guess it depends. There may be another, if there's this and one other that we're trying to balance, then, I think we have a hard decision. If there are 5 obvious ones and we don't need to take this one, then maybe maybe it'll take itself away anyway.
Well, and it's not that we won't do them either, right? It's just do we need to be forcing them in existing neighborhoods everywhere? But in new PUDs and stuff, absolutely, we could do them. So I think that to say that they won't happen isn't the case either. It's just whether or not we should be allowing them everywhere. And that's kind of a policy decision. It's the idea if we need 15,000 housing units, we can hypothetically look at our existing city limits and add 15,000 housing units just by saying, well, we've got 15,000 housing units now. You now can do a duplex on every single lot. We doubled it. Is that real? That doesn't actually equate to affordability. I'll tell you that right now, which I think is part of the problem with that. You have to grow and develop in greenfields to make it affordable. It's just the reality. There's tons of studies on it. This type of construction is not cheap. You're buying a house for $800,000 to $1 million to tear it down and build a fourplex, which that type of construction is not cheap. So it's not going to equate. Yes, you will be more dense and you won't say sprawl out more, but it's not going to equate to affordability. That's just the reality. And so it's something you have to balance. So the way we're looking at it is using all the tools in our toolbox, infill. We've got our annexation boundary, which based off of the housing units and city limits and undeveloped area, we can see in our annexation boundary roughly 100,000 population without having to necessarily expand it much. And this is an area where we could plan for growth. You still will be developing in some greenfields. You'll have a lot of infill development. So it's kind of a mixture of things rather than just saying we're going to, because it is a theory that you would just essentially take all the existing development in the city and just add more density to it. Don't expand infrastructure. Infrastructure has costs. You're going to use existing infrastructure and just essentially double everything. So it's how the city chooses to grow, and that's something we're considering right now.
Well, and I kind of would look at this as far as saying the established part parts of the city, I would look at it the same way I looked at it as the ADUs back when that conversation was happening. I think I was the only one to vote no on that across the board. But my part about that was exactly what you said is that, well, look, we've only had 5 since then. And that's what my point at the time was, is that it was being put out there as like a silver bullet to go through and bring down housing costs and everything. I was like, this isn't happening because the cost to go through and build one of these things is so high. Your price per square foot does not equate, linearly just because it's smaller. And so that's why I went through and opposed it. But then also just the whole fabric of the community, the fabric of the neighborhood aspect of it. I could see this paralleling that. But then again, I go through and I say, well, I don't think you would get many of them either. So like you said, maybe it is one that is in there because it would just not happen. It's a different reason to go for it because it probably just wouldn't happen. This is really weird.
Don't tell me we're thinking like politicians. Oh no. Oh no.
A lot of it comes from nationally, there's these developments get in front of city councils and planning committee.
And there's kind of 2 sides to this, I think, in some senses. In many ways, we've kind of already adopted this strategy as well through PUDs, and even the Anderson Ranch one that we looked at earlier here. It's an R3 zone. R3 is 6,000 square feet is our minimum lot size. What were they coming in at? Generally 4,200 to 4,500 square feet. And nobody really blinked an eye at that. And it's pretty common with most of the PUDs that we've seen to have that smaller lot size that's coming through. A lot of them have other deviations along with it, but I think that compared to 20 or 30 years ago when our minimum lot sizes were 7,000 square feet in those type of zones, we've dropped those to 6,000, and now the PUDs tend to drop that a little bit more. A 25% reduction, again, would be at 4,500 square feet. And right in line with the PUDs that we're seeing. So if we're approving them anyway, this would seem to be a relatively easy strategy to adopt with that. The flip to that is it was pretty lukewarm support. It was ranked 9th out of support in that community outreach. Although I don't know if everybody really understood that have been approving these lot sizes in any case. So it's certainly something to consider as we're moving forward. So. Okay. Next one was reducing aesthetic and related design standards for apartment buildings. This had the lowest amount of support by far.
Can we include stormwater ponds in that?
That wasn't listed in the state statutes here out of luck, Rory. But by far the lowest, virtually no support for it. It's also difficult to quantify because when you actually look at it, it's eliminating or removing at least half of the aesthetic, material, shape, bulk, size, floor area, and other massing requirements for multi-unit dwellings or mixed-use developments. So it's really hard to quantify what that means. And there was virtually no support. So it seemed to be one of the least likely ones that we'd want to adopt through there based on those two reasons.
You can't just tell the architect, make it look half as good.
We could try. We see how to measure that.
Plastic corrugated roof.
Yeah. Next one was to specifically allow for tiny houses as defined in the building code. So the building code's got an appendix Q, the International Residential Code. It's an optional appendix that cities can adopt. And so when we do our regular adoption every couple years, that wasn't included, but it's available under state regulations to adopt. Tiny home is under 400 square feet when you're looking at the actual definition in the building code. Most of the deviations or changes that they have from the regular building code are more just reflecting the fact that it's only 400 square feet. So some of the floor areas, different measurements that you would have just dimensionally within that smaller area are changed. This one actually was tied for the 3rd highest level of support with their community outreach. There's a lot of people thought it would be a good idea. Under zoning, even though right now it's not specifically provided for in building code, zoning would allow it. If somebody wanted to come in and put a tiny home, 400 square foot home on a property, there's nothing in zoning that wouldn't allow that. They still go on permanent foundations, whether they're under that appendix Q or under our zoning. They would still have the utility connections, the impact fees would be the same, parking would be the same. We would just review it that way. I think the closest we've come to this was that Vista Ridge cottages. They were a little bit larger. I think the smallest houses they had in there were more in the maybe 800 square foot range. I can't remember exactly, but they were moving towards this concept. I think where you're most likely to see these would be as ADUs, as options for ADUs, if people chose to do that. Whether that was restricted to what we have right now or expanded to everywhere. So it could be a good tool. It could make ADUs a little easier to build, but to Chad's point, it's still an expensive type of construction. At that level, it's not the linear per square foot calculation that you might do from something else. It's under 400, yeah.
To clarify that, that's under 400. Existing building code allows you down to 400. So this would be even, which I don't ever see somebody going even lower than 400. So that's what's interesting. Like even under our existing codes, you can build a house 401 square feet under the building code. So this is even smaller than that. Just to give you, like we haven't had a lot of demand for that. I think when you look at the utility costs and road construction, we've talked to a lot of developers about how in order to make something like this work, you essentially would need to take like a single family lot and find a way to put like 4 of them on one lot
Exactly.
in order to make it pencil, because the lineal foot of a city street, curbs, gutter, sewer, water, there's no way you're ever going to be able to make one of these pencil on it. So those are the types of things that we have to look at.
But Jared, when you're saying that the zoning currently allows that, the zoning allows it, but only one, right?
Yes.
Okay, so
Well, with
Unless there's an ADU or,
an accessory
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
structure.
so one, potentially two. But that's it.
You could, yeah. Somebody came through with an ADU, or if they've got an existing house and want to put one in the back, zoning would allow that right now.
Can you do a guest house, an ADU, and a tiny home?
No, in the zones where we get asked that all the time. People try to stack that, but basically, just think of it as
Well,
our
people
current
quite often
rules.
see guest houses and ADUs as the same thing. So I don't think people understand the
Yeah,
the
they're,
difference between
yeah,
them.
they can be essentially the same thing. I mean, what it really comes down to, and what we would normally tell people, is it's 2 dwelling units on that property. With our existing ADU, you can do it as a basement apartment. You can do it as an attached, both on ground level. You can do detached, but it's just 2 per property.
And then you can see where the parking issues come up because you're not allowed to require parking. So you just mentioned, like PJ said, we get that a lot. It's very opportunistic. Well, there's this house, I want to do this, and it's like, and there's no parking as it is on the street. So it's something that we try
Well,
and
one of the
consider
things
now.
that starts happening, because this happened in Oregon, in Portland, I studied up on it around that 2021, is what ends up happening is when the desired outcome for what the allowance is trying to allow for does not start to happen, your standards start lowering. They start lowering standards, and that's what they ended up doing there, to where there was no parking requirements to have, and then they started going through and moving the ADU or the tiny home to where it was flush with the front of the house, or you could have it in the front yard. It was just, everything just started moving, so, because they weren't getting the desired effect that they were trying to get with the allowance. So with this type of a situation, having you're definitely not going to be putting one of these on a single on a single lot. I mean, the cost of a lot, $120,000, and then dumping a tiny home on there fully built with a cost of $275,000 to build one of those things. 200 to 275 to build one of those, it just doesn't pencil out. So
Yeah, I think
Try-
the two situations where if we were to do this, you'd most likely see it would be one as an ADU. So you'd still have
Right.
2 dwelling units on the property. Right now, we cap an ADU at 1,000 square feet. This would allow somebody to do something at 400, so it's still kind of in that same general smaller range than what a typical single-family home is. The other is, it's possible, again, going back to like the Vista Ridge situation, that if somebody came in with a PUD or something and had smaller lot sizes, we're starting to see the cottage home type of concept where you'd have alley-loaded lots with common front yards. That's what Vista Ridge was doing and getting the smaller lot sizes in there. I think that you might see in that situation. But yeah, as a standalone type of unit, we wouldn't have a situation unless we went to allowing fourplexes or something like that, where we'd be allowing 4 on a lot or 5 on a lot. So I don't think that we would see that under what we would do if we went down this route. So any other comments on those? So, okay, so the next one is reducing building setback requirements by at least 25%. This one didn't, it was the 4th lowest level of support. It also kind of poses a few issues. You know, right now, our side setbacks, for example, are at 5 feet, which aligns with firewall requirements and the requirement that you don't have openings or doors on those sides. If we reduce that, say, down to 3 feet, then you kind of get this incongruity between what the zoning would allow you to do and these extra requirements you'd have under building. Similarly, in the front, you know, we could go from 15 feet is typically what we have for a front setback down to 10 feet. And that would bring it right up to utility easement that we have there. But when you talk to Flighted Electric, for example, they have extra buffers that are required around some of their boxes that could be in conflict with that type of a situation. So it's not a real smooth reduction to have those building setbacks reduced by 25% because we've kind of already set them to a logical spot. And again, there wasn't a ton of support for that out there in the community, but I didn't know what your guys' thoughts are on reduced setbacks.
Not on the sides. I mean, at some point you gotta have usable space. You know, I mean, you can't be turning sideways between your house and the neighbor's house with a fence that goes through and
You need
it
access as
separates
well,
them.
right?
Yeah, it's
Just
access
access.
and
Maintenance and.
I've always kind of thought maybe the back, you know, had some flexibility to it, but
Yeah. And it's not clear how they laid this out in the statute because presumably you'd have to reduce all of the setbacks.
Oh, okay,
You can
well then
choose
no.
one or the other. But it doesn't say that one way or the other, but that's the way that I would certainly read it is that, you know, you can't choose just your front setback and call it good probably. But, you know, anyway, that's what we're seeing. Any other comments or questions on that?
We may be able to do 2 at once. By reducing the setback 25%, you also reduce the lot size. And we could look at the rear and the fronts. Like you said, there's this weird balance right now of like, we have like this institutional knowledge of why these things have come about, and sometimes they're too big, but it's fire separations. If your house catches on fire, you don't catch your neighbor's house on fire, and it's just literally the smells out of the kitchen. And we go back to the tenement laws, light, air, noise, all these things are things we've kind of progressed and developed, and now they're like slowly trying to strip it all away just for the sake of housing. And we shouldn't be doing housing just for the sake of housing. It should still be quality. And that's why, you know, you start reducing setbacks, you create, you know, fires, and then, you know, you get a windstorm, and you know, you're trying to balance all this so that you can have protectable space and all that, in addition to just quality of life. So, yeah, I mean, we can definitely look at the rear and the fronts to a certain extent, but as PJ mentioned, there's utility easements, you've got all that. So even if you wanted to reduce it to 0, you can't, because there'd be nowhere to put electric and all that kind of stuff. But
If the city would take ownership of alleys, there would be. Oh, keep the loft.
or like I
Howie,
said, or the next step is, you get rid of sidewalks, and so then you're starting to lower the standard, or you get rid of boulevards and street trees, and it's like, okay, well, what do you want? So that's why there's this tiering of all these different standards, and how do you balance it also?
Okay, so the next one was increasing maximum building heights by at least 25%. And then of all the bulk and dimensional type of strategies, this had the most support. It was the 5th highest level overall. And in some ways, you know, this has a lot less impact than it might initially appear. You know, in our residential zones, we allow 35 feet as a matter of right. Hardly anybody builds up to 35 feet. You know, most are, you know, 20 to 25 feet tall. So increasing what that maximum is probably has limited impact on what you would actually see out there. So for that reason, it'd be something to consider. Basically, you know, again, in our single family zones, it would be going from 35 feet, and adding that 44 feet, I guess. Apartment zones are currently 45 feet, so that would increase them to 57 feet in those zones. And our commercial industrial zones are currently 60, but unlimited with a conditional use permit, so that would increase it to 75 feet as a matter of right. So anyway, it'd be something to consider with that. I'm not sure what, again, what type of practical impact this would necessarily have out there, but it would be a strategy. So any comments there?
No helpful ones.
Okay.
What's 25% more than unlimited? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's tough because we had already raised most of our heights and we don't get credit for any of it. But when you hear a lot of the narrative around, a lot of people don't like the tall, but we should be building up as much as we can, not out, which kind of balance, you're trying to balance everything. So really the main impact with this would be commercial developments and multifamily developments. I don't think it'll be as much an impact in duplex, triplex, single family zones. It will be commercial areas where we're already allow quite a bit of height for Montana standards. So
I think a lot of the conditional use permits that we've seen for multifamily have included a request for additional height too.
There has been, yes.
Yeah. So this would mitigate that or?
Okay. So the next one was allowing multifamily dwellings as permitted uses in office and commercial zones. And right now we allow multifamily in all of our commercial zones except for the B5, and there's very limited B5. B5 is a quasi-industrial zone, very limited amount. And of course, in the RA zones, which are residential apartment, it's allowed, but with a conditional use permit. So this wouldn't be a very big change from what we currently have. It would just basically take out the process of getting a conditional use permit. We'd still have the same standards in terms of parking, in terms of recreational amenities. It would still go through architecture review. It just wouldn't have the public hearing component of that. In 23, this legislature did pass a statute that basically mandated this anyway, although I believe we can opt out of that if we chose to. But the last couple of years, we've been operating under the requirement that we allow those as permitted uses in the commercial zones, but not the office. So the only real change from what we've been doing the last couple of years would be removing the conditional use permit requirement in the 2 RA zones. So it's pretty minimal. This actually tied for the highest level of support with our community outreach.
Is it allowed in B1?
Yes.
So okay, never mind. 4,000.
Well, it was listed with the CUP, but the state statute from 23 made it. So we hadn't updated the zoning ordinance, and we were operating on their idea was superseding, and then when we're updating the zoning ordinance later, it's going to be incorporated in there.
It just seems that there's a big difference between a 4,000 square foot retail limitation and then allowing apartments on the same parcel. And in B1, I mean, that's and you know why I'm saying that.
Yeah. So,
Just,
any other feelings on
But
that?
would that go as part of, like, if there was new construction that went in a commercial zone that had the building, had the commercial aspect to it down on the first floor, and then there was apartments above it?
It would apply to that as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
It just any multifamily use in those zones would just be permitted. You come and get your building permit, go through site review. All the design criteria would be the same. You just wouldn't have the public hearing component to the CUP.
Right.
Which is an aside note too, if you remember, there isn't a public hearing anyway, once you're under the land use plan because it's site-specific development. So under one of the changes that they did with this legislative cycle is there's a public comment period. So we would send out a public notice and can get public comment, but there wouldn't be the public hearing that we're used to. So keep that in mind as we're considering
There
that. as
can't
well.
be a public hearing? Or there shouldn't be one?
there isn't initially. There's ways that you can get to it through a series of appeals and rehearings and so forth. But it's also narrowed to only on
I mean,
issues that,
are we prohibited from having one?
yes,
Prohibited from having a public
I
hearing?
don't think that you can do it under that. And the only way that you can get to that is if you have that public comment period and issues are raised that weren't addressed in the land use plan or in your regulations, then you can move forward on potentially on hearings that are narrowly tailored to just that issue, not on the entire issue. But no, I don't think that you can make a developer go through a public hearing process.
So back to this one as a practical matter, state law, we're already under this, but as we adopt 382, we could potentially get out of it if we picked other ones. But also as a practical matter, in commercial zones, I don't think we've ever had a lot of pushback. It's more in the RA1, RA2 zones, which tend to be the buffer zone where you're closer to single family, that we've had a lot of and we've had way better design because of it. That's how we then can work with the neighborhood and maybe lower the height right next to the houses and create a design that fits. This kind of takes that away. And I guess another thing we did, so state law aside, in the core area zone B3 as kind of more like an enterprise zone, encouraging redevelopment, we made it a permitted use, so it was a little less red tape to encourage development in the core areas. So we had set a bit of a precedent to making it a permitted use when we did the core area.
Right. It's trended in that way, and then, we added in the B4, allowing second floor apartments as permitted uses to try and encourage the mixed use. So it's trended in that direction over the last 15 years in the city, in any case. I think it's a little bit of an aside on that. I think there's an open question about whether we would have anything as a conditionally permitted use if we can't do a public hearing. We can still have conditionally permitted uses, but it would just be staff review, which then is pretty much what you're doing for a building permit anyway, going through site reviews. So that's a topic for a different day on that.
Yeah, we can get rid of conditional use permits.
What's that?
So yeah, we can get rid of conditional use permits.
So, any case, that seemed to be a fairly straightforward one, and again, had quite a bit of public support as we were going there. The last one was allowing apartments with 5 or more units, anywhere that 3 or 4 unit apartments are permitted uses. And this has a couple nuances to it as well. So on one level right now, if we were to allow apartments as permitted uses in all office and commercial zones, zoning treats triplexes and higher as the same. So we don't distinguish between 3 and 4 and 5 units. So in some sense, to just be folding this into allowing those as permitted uses anyway. I think the potential risk that you would have is, again, because of that bill that almost made it through the legislature that would require you to allow 3 or 4 unit apartments as permitted uses in all zones. If you had this strategy, then that 3 or 4 would mushroom to 5. And so there could be unintended consequences as part of that. So anyway, it was right in the middle in terms of support that was out there, but I think that there are some risks that you might not want to get involved if there's, and I think there probably are at least 5 other strategies that would probably be more palatable.
Did they change that state rider that says 5 or more apartments have to be fire sprinkled? Because the IFC doesn't require that. It's a state regulation.
I'm not sure what they did in relation to that.
Because that's where the magic number 5 comes in, is because of that state.
Yeah, it's separate, but in terms of the zoning, we would treat 3, 4, and 5 the same. You wind up with density requirements, so the RA zones, you have to have at least 3,000 square feet per unit, so that would come into play. But in terms of the base use, we would see that as being the same.
I'll have to follow up, Rory. There was a couple, there was also one, a multifamily that wouldn't require the second access. I think
In
that
this legislature, I saw that, yeah.
there was that one as well. I'm not sure where it ended up. But there was a couple that would have impacted a scenario like this to,
Yeah.
to try and lower the cost of construction. Once again, but I'm not sure where those ones ended up off the top of my head.
So that gets us through all the strategies. So I don't know if there's any other comments or questions that anybody on the commission has.
So in going back to my initial thought, if I remember correctly, there are three, potentially four that are not necessarily no-brainers, but seem to be obvious. And then we need to select the two least annoying of the rest.
That's one way to put it. And, you know, we'll certainly bring that forward. As I mentioned earlier, this wasn't with the intent of selecting any tonight. We wanted to get your feedback on that. We didn't just want to say, hey, these are the five, adopt them. But we want to take that feedback, the continued public input that we're going to be getting, and then we can get more specific in terms of what some recommendations would be down the road.
But then I also didn't hear any big difference between what we're hearing from public feedback and what seem to be the no-brainers or the more obvious ones either. We
I
didn't
think a
have
lot-
something that like, hey, everyone wants this, but the city, but these are the issues that it creates.
Yeah, I think the only one, I think you're right. It's interesting as we're seeing kind of the numbers stack up that, you know, some of that stuff is just becoming clear and adding clarity to that. I think that the one that really has a break with that was the parking one. I don't think that there was a lot of support for that. If it was just up to us, it probably wouldn't get a lot of support from staff. It's just the fact of the matter is the legislature said we shall.
Yeah.
So I think that'd be the one outlier on what you're talking about. But otherwise, yeah, I would agree.
And that's where practically we could embrace that regulation. Well, technically we could embrace that regulation because practically it's unlikely to happen in that manner. I mean, there's very few developers that will try to do one parking space per apartment.
I would agree. I think that you'll see some that would want to do that. You know, like Jared talked, there's always going to be somebody trying to, you know, push the envelope on some of that.
Yeah.
But I think that the vast majority of, you know, apartment projects we've seen have been over what our minimum requirements are and are generally trying to get as close to 2 per unit as they can.
But we don't, again, that could be, if that makes the final cut of 7 out of 14, and then we have to eliminate 2 or something, that may or may not make it into that.
Yeah.
I have to ask a question. Does Planning Commission see a maximum parking requirement? Some cities have done that. I feel like I at least like to tell the commission what their options are. I don't think it's a good idea in this community, but meaning you can't go more than such. There's communities that have gone that route, trying to basically force density and force walking and less reliance on cars and such. So basically,
That's a
You
car
can-
diet.
what's that?
A car diet.
I'm just saying, the state's saying 1 per unit, so the city could say you can have a maximum of 1 per unit. That's what I'm saying. So it's something that Planning Commission could consider. It's another thing out there. Ironically, I think if that then made its way up to the state legislature, they would flip real quick because you would probably get a lot of complaints, but it's an option. And I just want to make sure you're aware and can consider, so. I'm not promoting it one way or another, but I just.
Don't ask me, I have 7 vehicles.
Josh, you're supposed to be part of the solution, not the
I
problem.
am
Come on.
not in any way, shape, or form part of that solution.
I guess I'm wondering, how does that tie into not having or reducing parking? What you're bringing up there, how does it tie into that?
So a lot of the
Maximum.
communities that go in that direction, it was kind of like Jared was saying, is to encourage less reliance on vehicles. You know, with I guess the theory behind it, if you only have 1 parking spot there or 2 as a max, then you're less likely to have other vehicles, more likely to have bikes. You know, if you've got kids and trying to encourage that type of transit in the community.
You can force it like around transit areas and that kind of, I just don't think we have the mentality or the infrastructure
That,
to.
I mean, but I just wanted council.
Yeah.
So another example would be, although our parking lots are pretty full around here, as we all know, but you know, the Home Depot and where maybe a third of the parking lot's empty and it's like, well, that's such a waste of space. I always look at those as opportunities in the future. We've seen it in town, you know, for future development when demands shift or change. If the demand's high enough, even these developments are gonna change. You know, the Gateway Community Center, what was Gateway West Mall? All that multifamily used to be parking lot. So our regulations, I always look at it as our regulations don't prohibit it in the future of like reuse of property. But I just wanted the planning commission to know that you also have the ability to say, well, you can have a maximum amount. If your required parking is X, you can't go above that. Most places are going above it. Either the corporations require more, like Costco, Home Depot, like we mentioned earlier, the multifamily, our requirement's only 1.5, they're coming in at 2.5. You have the ability to say, well, you can't go any higher than 1.5. I'm not saying that's a good option, but certainly if that's a growth method you think works or we should be looking at, you can consider it, and we could also look at heading that direction as well.
Was there any further discussion or?
Yeah, I was gonna say something if
Oh,
y'all
yeah.
can hear me.
Yep.
So when you guys were talking about the parking lot and Home Depot, like that being a bunch of extra space, I personally am a small human, but I drive a really large truck. And so I use that extra space to turn around and get in and out, especially when I'm pulling a trailer or two trailers in experience because of building projects. So maybe trying to shrink or limit parking is not our greatest idea. I would not agree with that, but I do understand the logic of trying to maybe limit that sort of thing in certain areas, but you know, maybe not in apartment complexes where we've got moving trucks in and out, or you know, bigger parking lots for commercial like Amazon, Home Depot, that sort of thing.
Okay. I guess I'll open this up for public comment.
Very patient.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cameron Dexter with Citizens for a Better Flathead. I live at 309 Hawthorne without an E Avenue. I am going to read some snippets from this. I sent it to the planning office earlier, so I'm sure you'll get those. I will not take much of your time. First of all, thank you all for taking on this effort, and thanks to the city planners for their continued outreach. I know this is a ton of work, and I appreciate all that you're doing and all the questions you're asking. So we strongly encourage that the land use plan to prioritize parks and the retention of undeveloped open spaces, meaning spaces that do not necessarily require extensive maintenance and mowing, but respect the wildlife and ecosystem that was once amongst these developments. For instance, we strongly recommend prioritizing linear parks in residential planning areas. Such parks offer havens for the community and wildlife while also beautifying the cityscape. Having a park located next to residential and business areas could increase property values and improve neighborhoods. Linear parks have environmental benefits such as enhancing biodiversity, providing habitats for wildlife, and improving air quality, and they encourage physical activity and promote stress reduction and mental health. Linear parks can effectively be integrated into already existing urban landscapes, even transforming abandoned and underutilized spaces, as seen as along the rail trail coming into downtown area. We would also add that given the nutrient and sediment strains on creeks like Ashley Creek and the increase in impervious surfaces, which this plan currently proposes, these environmental impacts should be mitigated with clear goals and objectives within this plan, and starting with the map for linear parks could be an excellent way to address this. CBF appreciates the policy set forth in this draft, preserving historical areas, pedestrian and bicycle-friendly infrastructure, protecting natural resources, pursuing a target housing study and strategy, and emphasizing outreach on housing, and those most impacted are all key elements in a successful plan for implementation of this agenda. However, at this point, we feel for the most part, these goals and objectives are too general and loosely written about measurable outcomes or specificity. of terms that can secure the neighborhood character, which will be critical to retaining the quality of life that residents of Kalispell desire as the city grows. Additionally, to truly understand the challenges that affordable and workforce housing poses for the city as it grows, we would encourage this housing study being done prior to finalizing the growth policy update. When it comes time to do a robust housing study, we suggest talking with customers of the warming center, food bank, and other facilities that provide services to those affected by the housing dilemma Kalispell and Flathead County is currently facing. We would also like to see how requirements for connected cluster developments could be used to retain the rural character of these neighborhoods. Given that Kalispell is close to meeting its housing goals for the number of units, please explain how these proposed density increases will directly address the dire affordable housing needs of the city and the need for this housing to be located near work centers. Please provide a projected number of these units these density increases could provide a full build out. Finally, as the city delves into strategies for housing, we sincerely hope that the volume will not be the only priority considered, and it sounds like it's not being. It is imperative that housing be built around the elements that make Flathead so special: water, forests, open lands, and not deplete these already dwindling resources. In the policies, it should be noted that stormwater drainage, transportation amenities, including sidewalks, bike paths, and safe road crossings, and emergency services must be required prior to the development. As we embark on revising and updating chapters to the Land Use Plan and the Main Street Safety Action Plan, CBF requests a schedule and memorandum regarding how the City Council and Commission will incorporate public participation before a final decision, as it has dramatically changed under MLUPA. While the agenda outlines the basics of public participation, please explain in greater detail how and when the public will be involved. The current Engage Kalispell website does not necessarily reflect when to submit comments or what chapter is being discussed, and as of right now, the public will need to dig through the commission agenda to find this info, and many residents will not or do not have that capacity. Again, thanks for all your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank you. Further public comment? Okay, I don't see any public comment. Yep.
So just a couple things I want to touch base with you guys on before you adjourn, presumably. One, just as kind of a note with the parks aspect, which is a lot of what came out in that letter. Parks Department is working on a parks master plan. And so the way that will be addressed in the land use plan is be incorporated by reference, and that'd be part of what we'd set the stage for as we're moving forward with the land use plan. But the Parks Department is working on that, so contacting them and getting engaged in their development of that plan would be a good thing. We did kind of have one, I guess, follow-up question for the commission with the format of the housing chapter, where we had a narrative and then followed it up with issues, goals, and recommendations, and how that was laid out. It's very similar to what our current growth policy is. People comfortable with that format? Did they want something different than that, or do you think that was a good way of laying that out?
Because that'll be a continual theme through all the chapters. It's similar to how we did it previously. Broad statements, goals that then we can look at implementing through zoning, through subdivision, through plans. You know, there could be a goal. Update West Valley plan to incorporate changing conditions, or you know, we're identifying all that stuff as we speak, but you know, just general format with that seemed okay.
I don't think I've ever really thought there was a reason to change it.
Okay.
Seemed good to me.
Cool. Okay, and then the last thing was just in terms of our schedule moving forward. As we kind of discussed, you know, we're kind of targeting, you know, maybe August or something for kind of a final consideration of a recommendation from the Planning Commission here. What we're looking at doing, stepping in through the following months, in addition to the public outreach that we're doing, would be continuing with the work sessions that we're doing in here and kind of stepping through the chapters, with housing being the first one because it's kind of a real central part of that plan, but stepping through the other chapters as we're moving forward through the summer. You know, as I mentioned, we've got 4 projects on the regular agenda next meeting on June 10th. So it's not going to leave a lot of time for a work session afterwards. And we were kind of planning on doing some extra meetings anyway. So I would anticipate, and we'll set those specifically as we move forward, I would probably have 1 or more additional meetings in June to July. But just kind of wanted to give everybody a heads up on that. And we'll try to target Tuesday evenings with that, but I would expect at least a couple additional meetings dedicated to work sessions for this.
Sound good to everybody?
Can I have
Have
one
your
last?
workload.
Can I have the one last? Yeah, that's how we did it last time to keep it moving. I think we
Yeah.
did 2 meetings a month. But also regarding housing, it is in our budget, our preliminary budget that
bring bagels?
we, what's that?
To bring bagels?
A housing study. So we've obviously done a lot with the data we have, but we do have budget for a housing study, which don't have the parameters of it. But in general, with that housing study, like I said, we've got a lot of data, but one thing we don't have is maybe how many housing units we maybe need by type and demographic and that kind of thing. We know there's demand, we know our vacancy is low, but it could say, well, the future demand is rather than say 50-50 single family, multifamily, maybe it's going to say, well, in the future, you're going to need to plan for 70% multifamily, which then can help us plan for that and look at our land use map. But, and if nothing else, it can be a great economic tool for developers knowing what our demand is in the valley. They don't have that right now. So we are looking at doing a housing study as well. That'll be next year and beyond. And then once that's completed, we can incorporate that back into the land use plan through an addendum or an amendment. But we will be working on that as well, so.
Jared, would that be similar to what University of Montana did, but just more in depth?
Yep, it'd be even more in depth and it'd be Kalispell's totally specific. And yeah, we would go out for an RFP, get a consultant on board and go through all that with them. Like I said, the one thing we don't have is we know that we have a housing demand. We maybe don't know, say, well, you need this many units at this area median income and this many units over the time period. We don't really have it broken down by income level necessarily per se, but that would help us get to that point.
Anything from the commission? Okay, I guess I'll adjourn the work session.